lot of things have happened in the world since I last recorded, including a federal election that we are all thankful is done and over with. But a lot of things are in the works that are going to be changing from one administration to the other, and a lot of that is going to eventually have some downstream effects on north central Kansas farmers and ranchers. And we're going to be talking about it today. I'm Luke Byers, and you are listening to Gab in the Cab. Today's episode of Gab in the Cab is going to be broken up into two parts, but both parts are going to be focused on the change in administration, especially in regard to the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. The first of these segments is going to be focused on the herbicide strategy program that was rolled out by the EPA this past July as a result of a Arizona District Court ruling back in 2023. The second half is going to be talking about what we can expect or project to happen to policy regarding biofuels and the demand for grain and feedstocks for the production of biofuels in the United States. As some may know, a 2023 Arizona District Court case ruled that the Environmental Protection Agency was not satisfying its mandate by the Endangered Species Act to manage chemical applications in agriculture that posed a risk to endangered species populations. Because of that, the EPA has, as of July 1st, released a nationwide ESA herbicide strategy program. Fortunately for many area producers, the EPA has identified that most cultivated fields are not primary habitat for endangered species on the Endangered Species Act protection program. So rather than forming the program around restricting herbicide applications per se, the program is focused on providing stipulations and guidance for producers to keep their herbicides from moving off the sites of their field applications. Now, this is all within the context of identifying where those endangered species registered in the Endangered Species Protection Program are living, where their habitat is. And those areas are designated by the EPA as pesticide use limitation areas, or PULAs. So, if an endangered species is within a PULA, that's an area where pesticide applications are going to be subject to the restrictions in this new herbicide strategy program. As of right now, there aren't a whole lot of PULAs within the state of Kansas, at least not that are recorded on Bulletins Live 2, which is the website that producers and applicators can visit through the EPA's website to see what those pesticide use limitation areas are around the country. So not a whole lot of them right now. However, I am anticipating that as this process of rolling out this herbicide strategy program moves along, it's very possible that we'll see more concrete, definitive structure and mapping of where those PULAs are and what people should be on the eye out for whenever it comes to EPA's requirements to satisfy the Endangered Species Act. So the way that the herbicide strategy program works is that when a herbicide gets registered by the program, it is given a number of quote-unquote risk points, which indicates the level of risk that the chemical poses to moving off-site of where it's applied. So for example, the first herbicide registered by the program, Liberty Ultra, was recently given a value of 3 points. So the reason we're talking about this subject today in relation to the change in administration and the EPA and all those other factors that go into the executive branch and agricultural policy is because the herbicide strategy program, A, has finally started moving herbicides through the system and getting them registered for this program. And B, we're going to also kind of look into what the implications are for the change in administration in light of this district court case that the judicial system handed down that might not necessarily be as malleable at the executive level as some people might want to think. So, for example, following up with the Liberty Ultra herbicide that has recently been registered with a herbicide strategy program and given a value of 3 risk points, in order to satisfy the conditions of the program so that the EPA doesn't basically come after folks for applying Liberty Ultra, producers that are applying it need to earn at least 3 mitigation points. So the mitigation points offset the risk points that applying a particular herbicide would present to an endangered species within the PULA. So, in order to offset those 3 risk points, if you're applying Liberty Ultra, you have to earn 3 mitigation points to mitigate the risk of moving that pesticide offsite. So, there's 2 main risk categories for offsite movement. Category 1 is drift, category 2 runoff. The Liberty Ultra label specifies requirements that satisfy the drift conditions of the program. Mitigation points come into play through the cultural practices to prevent erosion and runoff. So the EPA has created a mitigation menu for producers to sample to see what practices they can incorporate to earn mitigation points that offset the risk points of their herbicide applications. Because runoff risk varies by location, some counties receive quote unquote relief points, which reduces the amount of mitigation points required to offset the chemical's risk points. So, for example, if you are in a county in Kansas that has a high drift and runoff potential, that is going to be a place where you're going to require more mitigation points, and you're not going to receive as many relief points because there's a higher risk of offsite movement. Whereas if you're in, say, Western Kansas, you're in a county where it's less likely for there to be erosion and runoff due to lack of moisture and topography, then you're going to have more relief points, meaning that you're not going to have to earn as many mitigation points to offset the risk points of a particular herbicide within the PULA. So the River Valley Extension District straddles the line between the quote unquote medium and high runoff vulnerability zones. So Cloud and Republic counties receive 2 relief points, meaning that producers in those counties spraying Liberty Ultra would only need 1 additional mitigation point to satisfy the program conditions, whereas Washington and Clay counties receive 0 relief points. So those producers would still need 3 mitigation points. Fields can be accepted from those mitigation requirements, however, if they have a less than 3% grade or a predominantly sandy soil. So there are some locations that are going to satisfy this, particularly in the Republican River Valley Bottoms area. If your soil is predominantly sandy or you have a less than 3% grade because you're in that bottom ground, then as it concerns the Endangered Species Act, it's identified that the risk level in those areas is going to be lower for erosion and runoff than an area that has greater elevation difference due to topography or has leaching challenges endemic to it through various soil types. So what's interesting about the mitigation points that you can earn is that there's a kind of a variety of different practices that you can incorporate in your operation to earn those mitigation points to basically cover your bases so that the EPA isn't on your case about not satisfying the runoff requirements of the Endangered Species Act through your pesticide applications. And this kind of broken down into 5 groups of practices that you can do. So one of them is basically, what are you doing on a logistical level? So this would include tracking your mitigation practices, so keeping a logbook of your pesticide application and what you're doing to manage that. So if, and this is something that a lot of folks have come into the extension office in the past before, is basically getting a pesticide application book and just tracking your applications that way, and also making sure that you're taking notes as to what you're doing through your applications and your chemical management to make sure that erosion, runoff, drift are being prevented in your chemical applications. Another one is consulting and receiving recommendations or assistance from a runoff or erosion specialist. This is someone that the EPA categorizes as extension agents, which would be me, or NRCS, conservation district technicians, various individual, CCAs, various individuals in the agricultural community that would be able to provide guidance as to what practices should be put in place to mitigate erosion, runoff, and drift as it concerns pesticide applications to protect endangered species. And also, if you're participating in a qualifying conservation program, likely through an agency like the NRCS, that can also earn you mitigation points as well. So that's one group. Another group is applying lower than the maximum rate, but more than the minimum rate of the pesticide in question, reducing the treated portion of the field, incorporating it in the soil. So, and so that's kind of what are your application methods and rates. conservation tillage, no-tilling, contour farming. So there's a lot of different cultural practices that you can kind of choose from in the EPA's mitigation menu. And if you want a printed copy, you can always call the extension office and we can get that information to you as well. So there's so many different options that you can choose from whenever it comes to earning mitigation points. In fact, there's enough folks in the 4-county region that I know that incorporate these practices enough on their everyday that they don't have to change a single thing to their management practices in order to satisfy the conditions of these mitigation points. So really, they don't really have to change anything that they're doing. The people that might want to keep in mind what they're doing to change things whenever it comes to the application of chemicals in a pesticide use limitation area are if herbicides, pesticides get through the herbicide strategy program that have a much higher level of mitigation points, or if you are incorporating practices in your operation that are not necessarily conducive to preventing drift, erosion, and runoff. So those are things to keep in mind. And like I said, reach out to us at the extension office if you want that mitigation menu to see what you can do or what you're already doing to satisfy those requirements and kind of stay abreast of ways that things are going to be changing. That's the one thing that I wanted to mention as I close out this segment of the podcast episode, is that things are going to be changing. More herbicides will continue to be registered by the herbicide strategy program in the future. So keep these practices in mind going forward to help your farm operation stay in compliance and to avoid the punitive measures that the EPA may bring down. And if you have more questions about it, feel free to contact us at the extension office. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is whenever we think about the change in the administration at the federal level, there's also going to be change in the Environmental Protection Agency's administration. So as many may know, recently in the news, the new appointee that has to be confirmed by Congress to be the director of the Environmental Protection Agency is Lee Zeldin, who was most recently a candidate for the governor of New York a couple of years ago, was beat out by Governor Hochul there. But one of the backgrounds that Lee Zeldin has is his affiliation with the upstate New York oil and natural gas program. So one could think that perhaps he's going to have a little bit of a softer approach to this herbicide strategy program than perhaps someone in an alternative administration may have. So that's something to keep in mind. However, like I mentioned before, it's one thing to say a change in administration is going to change what rules exist from and are handed down from the EPA, but ultimately these rules are predicated on a judicial ruling from the Arizona District Court. So a federal court has ordered that the EPA create rules to manage for herbicide drift onto endangered species habitats. That's not something that the executive agency can change. It's only something that the judiciary can review. So what the herbicide strategy program looks like going forward may receive some tweaks and adjustments, but it's not as if we can accept it to go away whole cloth. So that's something to keep an eye on going forward. The only way that it could change whole cloth was if the legislature uh, passed some serious amendments or adjustments or repealing of the Endangered Species Act, which has now been on the books for over 50 years, so I would suspect that to be highly unlikely. So it's one of those things where even though the EPA has the appointee of Lee Zeldin, who might be a little more lenient, especially whenever it comes to working with farmers and ranchers to satisfy the requirements of the Endangered Species Act, it's not as if that requirement is going to go away altogether. So the other side of the Environmental Protection Agency change in administration to keep in mind is what this bodes for the world of biofuel production, particularly whenever it comes to corn-based ethanol in the United States and in Kansas, as well as biofuels and sustainable aviation fuel and other renewable diesel and all that sort of stuff that may be created not just through corn, but also through soybean meal, soybean oil, and other sources of feedstocks and grains that are produced in the state of Kansas. So a lot of people have been saying in the news and social media that Lee Zeldin, because of his association to the oil and natural gas industry in upstate New York and his policy agenda surrounding that in the past, that he might not necessarily be as friendly to the ethanol and biofuels industry as someone in an alternative administration might be. So that's one side of the equation to think about. Does that necessarily mean that farmers are, to put it bluntly, hosed as it comes to biofuels being a major demand source of corn and soybean meal and soybean oil in the state of Kansas and in the United States? Based on my observations, I would say a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. So, on the one hand, it may be so that Lee Zeldin, as the EPA director, may not necessarily be as hawkish on growing the demand for feedstocks as biofuel in the United States. However, one thing that I could say to counter that is that his policy approach and his historical record on policy may indicate that he may loosen some of the requirements on feedstocks that are going into certain things like sustainable aviation fuel and biofuels, biodiesel, and all that sort of stuff. Whereas a lot of those sources of fuel, biofuel and renewable diesel and all that sort of stuff that has been generated in a lot of plants around the country have been coming in from overseas. So we've been seeing a lot of used cooking oil coming in from China and South America that has been used to create biofuels. Something tells me that the attitude of this administration and Lee Zeldin as the appointee might change that to kind of put into place a policy approach that emphasizes utilizing American grown feedstocks in order to satisfy the demand for biofuel creation. Nothing is set in stone yet, and even if that were to come to fruition, we don't know necessarily what that would do in terms of offsetting perhaps a decreased level of demand for feedstocks in ethanol production in the States. However, the other side of growing, say, ethanol demand or biofuel demand, or really, derivatively speaking, inputs into that industry through feedstocks, through corn and soybeans, is by growing the overall quantity demanded for fuel. Because one of the studies I did during my undergraduate research at the University of Wyoming is showing that there is a alignment in the change in demand for gasoline and oil-based fuels, along with ethanol demand. And that's pretty easy to understand because the more fuel that you demand and the required incorporation of ethanol into those fuels in many cases means that there's going to be an increase in demand for ethanol. There's likely to be an increase in the equilibrium supply and demand for oil and gas because if the policy of Lee Zeldin, as he's mentioned in many of his public relations statements, is drill, baby, drill. If we are increasing the supply of oil, petroleum products into the U.S. economy, and ethanol supply rises as a result of that, the derived demand for ethanol to pair with the oil and gasoline supply is going to result in higher demand for feedstocks. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there's a lot of counterbalancing causes and effects that are projected to be taking place in the agricultural economy as we roll over to a new federal administration. So it's not clear whether things are going to net one way or net another way right now. But just because an individual might be more hawkish on the petroleum-based fuels production program in the United States and a little more dovish on the biofuel production in the United States doesn't necessarily mean that one will go up and the other will go down necessarily, because they're so intertwined at this point that it's hard to separate them. And here's why they're intertwined. And it's something that can't necessarily be tied down to an executive agency's policy, one administration to another. It really ties back to what the legislation on the books is regarding energy policy in the United States. We could look back on legislation as far back as like 1972 or the early 70s, whenever we first started seeing these federal level energy policies rolling out from Congress. But the statute that I want to focus in on more specifically is the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So just to kind of paint a backdrop to it, if you were to look at futures charts from, say, 2005, 2006 at corn specifically, we are trading in levels that we have not seen for 20 years or close to it. Back in 2005 and 2006, a lot of the time throughout those stretches, corn per bushel futures had a 1 in front of it, 160, 180, something like that, 250 on the higher ends. Then Energy Policy Act of 2005 rolls out what we call the Renewable Fuel Standard, which provided a massive subsidization of the demand source for grain for feedstocks in the production of ethanol, because it stipulated that as a part of this statute that there was a required, what they call a renewable fuel standard, basically requiring that a certain level of production of ethanol was required to be created and in proportion to gasoline and oil-based fuels in the economy. This was meant to be kind of a middle-of-the-road approach to satisfy the environmental community by reducing the proportion of fuel that was based in fossil fuels, and also to satisfy the agricultural community by providing an additional demand source for corn and other feedstocks to be used in the production of biofuels. Now, some of the studies that I've done on that in the past have indicated that the subsequent demand for ethanol, especially in that first decade or so after the renewable fuel standard was passed, it indicates that there was a contrived level of demand that was inflated above the natural level of demand that would exist in a free market without that renewable fuel standard subsidy. However, recent indications have shown us that the technology to create ethanol, to make ethanol from biofuels, has improved to the level that we're now seeing an over a 1-to-1 energy return on investment, whereas in the past it wasn't. So basically, what I'm saying now is ethanol, we're now at a point where ethanol is paying for itself in its creation, and it's not basically a de facto tax on the American taxpayer that it might have been 10 or 15 years ago. Furthermore, the renewable fuel standard is statute. So it's not something that the EPA director or the Secretary of Agriculture can come in and say, we're changing this, because it's on the books what the requirements are. And there have been subsequent amendments to it over the course of time. But overall, it's a law that the administration and the executive branch has to abide by whenever it rolls out its policy as it regards energy, referring back to the environmentalists receiving the bone that was thrown to them by the Bush administration back in 2005, satisfying the requirements of the mandate of the Environmental Protection Agency. So again, as with the herbicide strategy program that was court-ordered this past year, that's not going away just because the administration is changing. The renewable fuel standard, passed into statute, is not going away just because there's a change in administration. And so maybe this will give me a chance to go on a small monologue, just kind of lauding the durability of the American institutions that are created and defined by the separation of powers we observe in the federal government. We have an executive branch that enacts policy according to its own kind of flavor and emphases, but we have a legislature that has statute on the books that the executive branch cannot necessarily deviate from, and a judicial branch that interprets them without necessarily being affected by any particular administration or congressional overtures. This helps establish some level of stability in what we can expect as it concerns policy going forward. Not that nothing will change, but also it's not as if we're going to have radical overhauls of how the economy grapples with various things like pesticide applications and biofuel production, one administration to the next. Just like the Endangered Species Act and the Renewable Fuel Standard, the cooperative extension system is here to stay as well, because we are part of statute that is on the books as a result of the Smith-Lever Act of 1914. Yes, our federal dollars and oversight is funded by the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which is an executive agency, but ultimately our existence is mandated by statute. So that's one of the things that you can expect from us going forward, is No matter what the change in administration is, no matter what the changes in policy are, we at the Cooperative Extension System are here for you to help answer your questions and partner with you to solve the problems that and challenges that your individual agricultural operations face every day. We're located in Clay, Cloud, Republic, and Washington counties here in the River Valley Extension District, with offices in Clay Center, Concordia, Belleville, and Washington. If you have any additional questions about the change in administration's effects on the agricultural economy, both regarding the Endangered Species Act and pesticide use limitation areas, or as it regards what we can expect from biofuel production and demand for feedstocks in the energy sector, feel free to reach out to us. My office is in Clay Center, and my phone number there is 785-632-5335, or you can reach me by email at lsbyers@ksu.edu. You have been listening to Gab and the Cab. We appreciate your support and your joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing you next time.